He highly arrogantly discarded his highly devoted, simple wife entirely for a significantly wealthier, elite heiress, highly toxically explicitly telling her that she was absolutely just a highly pathetic, dead weight, violently holding him completely back from his highly massive, elite destiny. He genuinely, toxically, thought he had flawlessly won. He possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that his highly pathetic, simple wife was officially, secretly, the absolute sole heir entirely to a massive, multi-billion-dollar global empire. And exactly when she finally, miraculously, unleashes her absolute, terrifying true power, she absolutely doesn't entirely just highly aggressively seek highly toxic revenge. She completely, violently annihilates his absolute entire, massive universe. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you fiercely crave highly explosive stories entirely about massive karma, highly brilliant transformations, and the absolute ultimate, highly satisfying revenge, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button to strongly support our content. Subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if your partner left you for someone richer in the comments below. Let's get directly into The Secret of the Queen, the Gilded Cage of Lies, to the highly observant, massive outside world. Charlotte Sullivan was completely, painfully ordinary. She quietly lived entirely in a highly modest, two-story house, entirely in a highly quiet suburb, entirely of massive Boston. Her highly simple days were an incredibly quiet, highly rhythmic routine, entirely of meticulously tending her highly small, beautiful garden, enthusiastically volunteering entirely at the highly quiet local library, and lovingly cooking highly elaborate hot meals entirely for her highly ambitious husband, Julian Vance. She happily drove a highly reliable 5-year-old Toyota, meticulously clipped highly cheap discount coupons, and her absolute greatest, highly pathetic indulgence was a highly simple weekly latte entirely at the highly local coffee shop. Highly sweet, incredibly simple, and completely, utterly devoted entirely to the exact man she had happily married exactly 7 agonizing years completely ago. Julian was officially the absolute, highly beating center entirely of her massive universe. He was devastatingly handsome, highly ambitious, and successfully possessed a highly toxic charisma that could highly effortlessly charm the absolute most highly hardened, massive cynic. He brutally worked exactly as a highly mid-level financial analyst, entirely at a highly respectable but completely unremarkable corporate firm entirely downtown. To his highly competitive colleagues, he was an absolute man, highly actively on the massive rise, incredibly sharp and highly hungry, but highly pathetically held completely back entirely by his highly humble, pathetic circumstances. He highly frequently, highly bitterly lamented his highly pathetic luck entirely in massive life. Highly toxically talking entirely about highly grand, massive ambitions that visually seemed highly ridiculously, completely out. Entirely of his highly pathetic reach. If I absolutely only successfully possessed the highly massive capital, he would highly toxically sigh directly to his highly pathetic work friends, completely over highly cheap beers. I could highly easily, absolutely be actively running exactly this massive city. Exactly what absolutely no one completely knew, highly least entirely, of absolutely all Julian, was that the beautiful woman he confidently came completely home directly to absolutely every single night. The beautiful woman who lovingly mended his cheap socks and highly meticulously managed their highly tight, pathetic budget. Absolutely was not Charlotte Sullivan, the highly pathetic orphan she highly falsely claimed to absolutely be. She was officially Charlotte Sterling, the absolute soul, massive heiress entirely to the highly massive Sterling global conglomerate. A highly terrifying, worldwide massive empire, completely with highly lucrative holdings, entirely in advanced technology, massive real estate, and global energy. Highly officially valued entirely at significantly over $2.5 billion. Charlotte had beautifully met Julian completely during her absolute senior year, entirely at elite Harvard University. Exactly where she highly enthusiastically studied art history, completely under a highly secure, fake name. Highly desperately actively wanting to miraculously taste absolute, pure normality, completely after a highly suffocating childhood. Highly strictly controlled completely by elite tutors, massive bodyguards, and the highly freezing, calculating elite world entirely of high finance. Her highly powerful parents had absolutely been highly brilliant, but incredibly distant figures. Significantly more highly comfortable, entirely in a highly sterile boardroom than entirely in a highly warm playroom. They had highly tragically died entirely in a highly catastrophic private jet crash exactly when she was exactly 18 young years old, ruthlessly leaving her completely entirely in the highly strict care entirely of her highly formidable grandmother, Mrs. Augusta Sterling. And exactly as the absolute sole, massive heiress entirely to their highly vast, multi-billion-dollar fortune, completely overwhelmed entirely by the massive, crushing weight entirely of her highly massive inheritance and the highly intrusive, prying eyes entirely of the massive world. Charlotte had highly meticulously devised a highly complex plan entirely to successfully escape. Even exactly, if absolutely only entirely, for a highly brief, beautiful time. Julian. Exactly then, a highly passionate business student completely on a highly modest scholarship, was absolutely everything that her highly toxic elite world absolutely was not. He was incredibly passionate. He vividly saw her entirely for exactly who she truly was, and highly apparently, absolutely, did not fiercely care a single bit entirely about massive wealth or elite status, when he beautifully proposed a highly simple, quiet life, completely far, far away, entirely from the highly blinding toxic pressures entirely of the massive elite. Charlotte highly romantically saw it exactly as a highly beautiful fantasy miraculously come completely true. She highly genuinely believed she had miraculously found a highly true man who fiercely loved her. Absolutely not her highly massive last name, and exactly so, completely with a highly heavy heart, but completely with a highly hopeful, beautiful spirit. She fiercely made a highly massive decision. She highly legally placed her absolute entire massive fortune completely into a highly secure, blind trust. Highly exclusively accessible, absolutely only completely, through a highly complex, strict series entirely of massive protocols, profoundly known, absolutely only completely to her, and the absolute most highly trusted elite advisor entirely of her massive family, Mr. William Roth. She highly toxically explicitly told Julian a highly fabricated, pathetic story entirely of a highly lonely childhood entirely in a highly forgotten, pathetic orphanage, and flawlessly adopted her highly secure, brand new identity exactly as a highly simple woman, completely with absolutely nothing, significantly more than the pure love entirely of her arrogant husband. for exactly 7 agonizing years. She flawlessly played the highly pathetic role completely, to absolute perfection. She successfully found highly genuine, pure joy, entirely in absolute anonymity. Vividly seeing Julian highly aggressively strive, she profoundly felt a highly massive sense entirely of pure pride. She highly genuinely believed she was highly lovingly supporting his beautiful dreams, that their pure love was a highly impenetrable fortress, flawlessly built completely on a significantly more highly solid foundation than highly cold money. But the highly terrifying cracks had absolutely already aggressively begun to highly visibly show completely in her highly fragile fortress. The highly massive ambition entirely of Julian, exactly once a highly beautiful quality she deeply admired, had completely, violently, toxically, curdled completely into highly bitter, toxic resentment. He violently grew incredibly tired entirely of their highly modest, pathetic life. He aggressively began to highly toxically make highly sarcastic, cruel comments entirely about her highly simple, cheap clothes, their highly budget-friendly, pathetic vacations, and her absolute, complete lack entirely of highly elite connections. Did you vividly see the highly massive engagement ring entirely of David Chan's brand new elite fiancé? He would highly toxically comment completely after a highly boring work event, his piercing eyes violently shining completely with a highly greedy, toxic light. It absolutely must be exactly 10 massive carats. Her highly powerful father is officially a highly massive shipping magnate completely from Singapore. Then he would intensely look directly down entirely at Charlotte's highly simple, plain gold wedding band, a highly pathetic symbol entirely of the highly simple life he exactly now highly toxically despised, and his handsome lip would violently curl completely into a highly slight, toxic sneer entirely of pure disdain. He aggressively began to brutally work incredibly late, highly enthusiastically attending highly exclusive networking events that highly suspiciously left him aggressively smelling entirely of highly expensive women's perfume. That absolutely was not hers. He violently became incredibly distant, his highly intimate touch incredibly infrequent and highly superficial. The highly easy, pure laughter that exactly once beautifully filled their highly small home was completely, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly tense, suffocating silence, violently punctuated completely by the highly deep, highly dramatic sighs entirely of Julian's absolute dissatisfaction. Charlotte profoundly felt the highly toxic shift completely deep entirely in her fragile bones. A highly freezing, massive dread aggressively began to violently accumulate completely in her heavy stomach. She highly desperately attempted to actively talk completely with him, to miraculously close the highly rapidly growing, freezing gap completely between them. But her highly soft, gentle questions were highly aggressively met completely with highly toxic irritation and highly brutal accusations. What exactly is there to actively talk completely about, Charlotte? He violently snapped, exactly one highly tense night, aggressively throwing his highly cheap briefcase completely onto the small dining table she had highly meticulously prepared, completely with so incredibly much pure care. We are completely violently stagnant. We are actively going absolutely nowhere. I am actively, violently, suffocating, and you are highly pathetically content entirely to simply highly pathetically float. I highly genuinely thought we were incredibly happy, she whispered incredibly softly, completely with her fragile heart violently aching. I highly genuinely thought exactly this was exactly what you fiercely wanted. I fiercely wanted a highly elite partner. He violently spat, his toxic voice heavily dripping completely with pure contempt. Absolutely not a highly pathetic housekeeper. I highly desperately need absolutely someone who can highly successfully help me. Absolutely someone completely with highly massive resources. The highly heavy word violently hung completely in the highly tense air, perfectly between them. Incredibly ugly and highly sharp. Resources. It was the exact, highly massive word that had highly suffocatingly defined her absolute entire life. A highly terrifying word, completely from which she had frantically fled. Absolutely, only entirely for the exact man, entirely for whom she had highly bravely sacrificed absolutely everything, to highly maliciously violently throw it completely back directly into her pale face. She intensely looked directly at Julian, the highly toxic stranger confidently standing perfectly in front, entirely of her. His handsome face violently twisted completely by a highly greedy, toxic ambition she had absolutely never, ever, truly vividly seen completely before, and entirely for the absolute first time in exactly 7 agonizing years. She profoundly felt the highly terrifying ghost entirely of Charlotte Sterling violently stir completely inside her. The highly pathetic game that beautifully began exactly as a highly romantic, beautiful escape was actively about to completely, violently transform completely into a highly brutal, massive war. And she was officially the absolute only terrifying person who profoundly knew the highly absolute, true, massive power entirely of the highly lethal weapons completely at her absolute disposal. Julian thinks his wife is just a poor orphan holding him back. What would you do if your partner talked to you like this? Tell us below. The day of reckoning. The highly catastrophic, final lethal blow aggressively arrived entirely on a highly crisp, freezing October evening. The highly crisp air heavily loaded, completely with the highly bittersweet smell, entirely of wood smoke and highly decaying autumn leaves. It was officially their highly anticipated 7th wedding anniversary. Charlotte had aggressively spent the absolute entire beautiful day highly meticulously preparing a highly massive feast. A highly beautiful, romantic recreation entirely of their absolute first date. Highly meticulous, handmade pasta. A highly rich bolognese sauce she had highly patiently simmered entirely for agonizing hours. And a highly expensive splurge bottle entirely of fine Chianti. She flawlessly wore a highly simple, beautiful blue dress that he had exactly once, highly lovingly explicitly stated, was officially the exact beautiful color entirely of his absolute favorite sky. She highly anxiously waited completely, with the small table flawlessly set, completely, with her absolute best, cheap china. The highly romantic candles beautifully flickering. Her fragile heart, a highly fragile, complex mixture, entirely of pure hope and blinding apprehension. Julian confidently arrived completely home. Exactly 3 agonizing hours, incredibly late. He absolutely didn't even highly actively glance entirely at the highly meticulously prepared, romantic dinner. His handsome face was highly flushed, completely with highly toxic excitement. His piercing eyes violently shone completely, with a highly manic, toxic energy she absolutely did not completely recognize. He highly aggressively threw a highly thick, cream-colored envelope completely onto the small table. Exactly where it violently landed completely, with a highly soft thud, perfectly right next, completely to the highly untouched, cold breadsticks. "What exactly is exactly this?" Charlotte asked, her beautiful voice incredibly small. "Exactly that," he stated, highly aggressively pulling completely at his cheap tie, a highly triumphant, toxic smile playfully dancing completely on his handsome lips. "Is officially our massive future, or highly significantly more accurately, my massive future." Her soft hands violently trembled exactly as she highly cautiously opened the thick envelope. Securely inside were officially the highly official divorce papers. The highly sterile, freezing legal language was a highly brutal, toxic counterpoint completely to the highly romantic, beautiful dinner she had highly lovingly prepared. The heavy words violently blurred completely into a highly meaningless mess, but the highly toxic message was completely, terrifyingly clear. Irreconcilable, massive differences. No highly toxic fault, a highly clean, rapid break. Signed, Julian. "I absolutely do not completely understand," she violently stammered, intensely looking directly at him completely with her beautiful eyes completely wide open, entirely in absolute incredulity and massive pain. "Our highly beautiful anniversary. Oh, Charlotte, please," he highly toxically mocked, highly aggressively waving a highly dismissive hand. "Do absolutely not actively be so incredibly, pathetically naive. Did you genuinely, truly think exactly this was actively working? This highly small, highly pathetic, useless life? I am officially destined entirely for significantly more. I have highly miraculously been highly generously given a highly massive opportunity. A highly real, exactly one. And I absolutely cannot highly pathetically possess you violently holding me completely back." The highly prominent name entirely on the highly legal documents. The highly official petitioner, perfectly in front entirely of her, was exactly a highly familiar name that he had highly toxically mentioned completely with highly rapidly growing frequency. Absolutely always, completely, with a highly sickening tone, entirely of absolute reverence. Genevieve Thorne, the highly arrogant heiress entirely to the massive Thorne banking fortune. A highly elite woman, whose highly glossy photograph was a highly absolute staple entirely of the highly exclusive society pages. Absolutely always, heavily draped, entirely in highly expensive diamonds and elite haute couture. A highly powerful woman, entirely of massive resources. The highly complex pieces entirely of his highly suspicious, toxic recent behavior completely, violently, clicked flawlessly into highly perfect place, completely with a highly sickening, terrifying clarity. The highly suspicious late nights, the highly secret, hushed phone calls, the highly expensive aroma entirely of Chanel No. 5 fiercely clinging completely to his cheap shirts. He absolutely hadn't entirely just highly tragically fallen completely out, entirely of pure love, completely with her. He had highly actively, maliciously, been actively replacing her. "You are actively leaving me completely for her?" The beautiful voice entirely of Charlotte was literally barely a highly fragile whisper. The massive pain was absolutely something incredibly physical. A highly sharp, lethal shard, entirely of freezing ice, violently piercing completely through her fragile chest. "Leaving you? Darling, exactly that highly incorrectly implies that we were absolutely ever entirely on the exact same highly equal level entirely to absolutely begin completely with," he stated. His absolute cruelty completely, utterly absolute. He aggressively began to highly frantically pace completely around the highly small, cheap living room. His highly arrogant movements highly suddenly way too incredibly massive, entirely for the highly cramped space. Genevieve profoundly understands me. She profoundly understands massive ambition. Her highly powerful father, Mr. Harrison Thorne, is highly actively willing entirely to highly successfully make me an elite senior partner entirely in his highly massive, brand new private equity firm. These are officially the highly elite major leagues, Charlotte. Exactly this is exactly where I truly, genuinely belong. He finally completely stopped and intensely looked directly at her. His piercing gaze highly arrogantly sweeping completely over her highly simple blue dress. Her highly pathetic, tear-stained pale face completely with highly undisguised, toxic pity. Look, I will absolutely be completely fair. The highly modest house officially possesses absolutely some highly pathetic equity. You can highly generously successfully keep it. You can highly generously successfully keep the highly cheap car. It absolutely should be highly sufficient entirely for a highly simple woman, completely with your highly simple, pathetic needs. Think entirely of it exactly as a highly generous severance package, entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years, entirely of highly pathetic service. 7 agonizing years entirely of highly pathetic service. Absolutely not pure love. Absolutely not highly equal partnership. Service. The highly heavy words loudly resonated completely in the highly sudden, deafening silence entirely of the small room. He highly toxically viewed her exactly as a highly pathetic employee that he was exactly now highly ruthlessly firing. The pure love she had beautifully poured completely into his highly pathetic life. The highly massive sacrifices she had highly bravely made. The highly massive identity she had completely, violently discarded. Absolutely all, entirely of it, was completely, utterly worthless, completely to him. He hadn't absolutely just violently broken her fragile heart. He had completely, violently invalidated her absolute entire, massive existence. I highly generously gave you absolutely everything, she stated. The heavy words violently choked entirely in her dry throat, completely by highly hot, unshed tears. Julian laughed loudly. A highly short, incredibly sharp, toxic sound, completely devoid entirely of absolutely any genuine humor. You generously gave me absolutely nothing, Charlotte. You successfully possessed absolutely nothing highly valuable to generously give. That is exactly the absolute, entire, highly toxic problem. He aggressively picked completely up his highly cheap briefcase. Absolutely not the highly worn leather. Exactly one that she had highly lovingly bought him exactly 5 agonizing years, completely ago. But a highly sleek, brand new, expensive aluminum, exactly one that she had absolutely never, ever vividly seen completely before. A highly expensive gift. Completely without a single doubt, completely from Genevieve. He completely stopped perfectly at the heavy door, smoothly turning completely around entirely to highly aggressively deliver exactly one absolute last, highly crushing fatal blow. I highly genuinely hope you successfully find a highly quiet, pathetic life entirely for completely yourself, he stated, his toxic voice heavily loaded, completely with highly condescending, toxic magnanimity. Perhaps you can highly pathetically, brutally work entirely in exactly that highly boring library you fiercely love so incredibly much. It flawlessly suits you, Simply highly rapidly sign the highly legal papers. It is significantly better, entirely for absolutely everyone, exactly if we highly efficiently do exactly this incredibly fast and highly cleanly. The heavy door violently slammed completely shut, completely behind him, ruthlessly leaving Charlotte completely alone, completely in the highly flickering romantic candlelight. The highly delicious smell, entirely of the highly perfect bolognaise sauce she had highly lovingly prepared, yet suddenly physically felt incredibly nauseating. The highly beautiful meal was a highly pathetic monument completely to her absolute own, highly foolish stupidity. He highly arrogantly thought he was violently leaving a highly pathetic, penniless orphan completely in his highly toxic wake. He highly toxically thought he was highly efficiently, highly getting completely rid, entirely of a highly pathetic dead weight, entirely, to miraculously ascend directly to the highly elite stratosphere, entirely of the massive elite. He possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea entirely of the highly catastrophic, violent storm he had literally just completely, violently unleashed. In exactly that highly specific moment, exactly as the absolute last, highly fragile vestiges entirely of her pure love entirely for him, completely, violently died. Absolutely something completely else, highly miraculously took its highly massive place. The massive pain was absolutely still completely there. A highly raw, incredibly open, gaping wound. But completely underneath, a completely different, highly terrifying feeling aggressively began to violently simmer. It was incredibly cold, highly hard, and completely, utterly unfamiliar. It was absolute, white-hot rage. Massive rage, exactly the massive size entirely of the Sterling Empire. She intensely looked directly at the highly toxic divorce papers, perfectly on the small dining table. The highly legal, sterile instrument entirely of her complete humiliation. Highly cleanly and incredibly rapidly, he had highly toxically, explicitly said. She aggressively picked completely up her cheap phone, her soft hand surprisingly, incredibly firm. She rapidly scrolled completely through her highly simple contacts, rapidly passing completely by the highly local plumber and the highly normal dentist. Directly to a highly specific name she had absolutely not actively called entirely in exactly 7 agonizing years. The bright screen brilliantly glowed completely with exactly 2 highly heavy words. William Roth. Her soft thumb highly dangerously hovered perfectly over the highly green call button. The highly terrifying woman who would highly actively make exactly this highly explosive call. Absolutely would not be the highly heartbroken, pathetic wife entirely in the highly simple blue dress. It would officially be the multi-billionaire elite heiress that he absolutely never, ever completely knew officially existed. The highly pathetic game was completely, permanently vicious. The highly explosive, massive war was actively about to violently begin. Charlotte is about to unleash her billionaire persona. What is the first thing you think she should do to destroy Julian? Tell us below. Part 3. The Unleashing of the Titan. The absolute first 24 highly agonizing hours completely after Julian confidently left were an absolute, highly terrifying blur entirely of hollow-eyed, massive shock. Charlotte absolutely did not violently cry. The massive pain was way too incredibly, highly deep, entirely, for hot tears. A highly vast, incredibly empty dark cavern, exactly where her fragile heart, absolutely, usually, highly actively beat. She smoothly moved completely through the small house exactly like a highly terrifying ghost. Her highly modest home exactly now, a highly pathetic museum entirely of their highly toxic, shared lies. She aggressively took a highly massive black garbage bag, and completely with highly cold, incredibly methodical, absolute precision, she highly ruthlessly swept, absolutely, every single highly fake photo, absolutely, every single highly pathetic gift, absolutely, every single absolute last, tiny trace entirely of him, completely into it. It absolutely wasn't highly therapeutic catharsis. It was an absolute, highly brutal exorcism. By early dawn, the small house was completely, violently stripped entirely of their highly toxic shared past. Exactly as incredibly empty, exactly as she profoundly felt completely inside. She finally highly bravely, generously permitted completely herself to intensely look directly into the small mirror. The highly terrifying woman who intensely looked directly back was an absolute stranger. Her piercing eyes, absolutely usually so incredibly, completely full, entirely of highly soft warmth, were incredibly dark and highly tormented. She highly pathetically wore exactly one entirely of the highly old, faded t-shirts entirely of Julian, exactly as a highly pathetic nightgown. This was officially the highly pathetic woman he had violently discarded. The highly weak, incredibly simple, highly pathetic penniless orphan. He had highly toxically created exactly this highly pathetic version entirely of her. And he had completely, violently destroyed it. It was highly officially, massively time entirely for Charlotte Sterling to confidently come completely home. She highly aggressively showered. The highly boiling hot water, a highly blessed violent shock, completely to her traumatized system. She flawlessly dressed absolutely, not entirely, in her highly usual, modest attire, but entirely in the absolute only highly expensive, emergency outfit she had highly secretly kept flawlessly hidden, entirely in the absolute back, entirely, of her small closet. A highly bespoke pair, entirely of highly tailored black trousers, a highly expensive silk blouse, and a highly simple but incredibly elegant pair, entirely of highly expensive designer leather flats. They were highly expensive remnants completely from her highly elite former life. A highly secure contingency she had highly desperately prayed to absolutely never, ever actually need. Then, she fiercely made the highly explosive call. The highly secure line loudly rang absolutely only exactly once, completely before a highly familiar, incredibly crisp and highly calm voice answered. "William Roth, highly actively speaking." "William," she stated, her absolute own beautiful voice actively sounding incredibly rusty and highly strange, completely to her absolute own ears. "It is officially me." There was a highly pregnant pause. A highly massive instant entirely of absolutely stunned, dead silence, completely on the absolute other side entirely of the highly secure line. William Roth, the highly terrifying, gray-haired and highly impeccably dressed absolute head, entirely of Sterling Legal, had absolutely been the absolute closest, most highly trusted confidant entirely of her loving father, and had highly meticulously managed the highly complex affairs entirely of her massive family, completely with highly unbreakable, fierce loyalty, entirely for significantly over 30 agonizing years. He was significantly more entirely of a true father, completely to her, than her absolute own had absolutely ever been. Charlotte. He highly emotionally breathed the beautiful name, a highly complex mixture entirely of massive surprise, absolute relief, and incredibly profound, completely inexpressible, massive concern. "My beautiful dear, are you completely perfectly fine?" "No," she stated firmly. The exactly one single heavy word, flawlessly transmitting an absolute entire, massive world entirely of massive pain. "I absolutely am not, but I absolutely will completely be." She took a massive, incredibly deep breath. The highly stale air entirely in the highly sterile house, highly suddenly physically feeling heavily charged, completely with a highly massive, brand new energy. "William, I am actively, highly confidently coming completely back. I highly aggressively want you to highly urgently execute Protocol Alpha completely, utterly, immediately." Protocol Alpha. The highly secure, absolute codename they had highly meticulously devised agonizing years. Completely ago entirely for the highly immediate dissolution, entirely of the highly secure blind trust, and the highly absolute, complete restoration entirely of her highly official legal identity and highly massive financial power. It was the highly secure, absolute emergency panic button, the highly lethal glass entirely. To violently break entirely, in highly absolute case entirely, of highly catastrophic disaster. "Safely consider it highly flawlessly done," William firmly stated. His deep voice, highly instantly, violently, shifting completely from highly concerned guardian, directly to highly ruthless, incredibly efficient, elite executive. "A highly armored luxury car will absolutely be directly at your highly specific location entirely, in exactly 1 short hour. We successfully possess the massive luxury penthouse entirely at the highly exclusive Four Seasons entirely in massive Boston, completely ready entirely for you. Your highly elite security team is actively mobilizing exactly as we actively speak." "What exactly are your highly immediate, absolute instructions?" "The highly pathetic house," she stated, intensely looking directly at the highly small, pathetic suburban box that had absolutely been her highly toxic cage. "Highly aggressively sell it. Highly generously donate the highly pathetic contents completely to absolute charity. I absolutely do not desperately want to vividly see absolutely anything completely from exactly this highly pathetic life absolutely ever completely again." She violently paused, her piercing gaze violently falling directly onto the highly toxic divorce papers, absolutely still perfectly on the small dining table. "And William, I highly desperately need you to highly aggressively find completely out absolutely everything there is to explicitly know entirely about a highly arrogant man explicitly named Harrison Thorne and his highly elite private equity firms. I absolutely also highly aggressively want a completely full, highly detailed dossier, highly specifically, entirely, on his highly arrogant daughter, Genevieve, and my highly toxic ex-husband, Julian Vance. I absolutely already officially possess a highly preliminary, massive file, entirely on the highly toxic Thorns," William stated, his deep tone incredibly somber. "Harrison has absolutely been highly desperately attempting to highly maliciously make highly aggressive inroads completely against Sterling Shipping entirely for agonizing years. This absolutely is not a highly pathetic coincidence, Charlotte. It highly apparently seems that your highly arrogant husband was highly maliciously poached. Exactly like a highly valuable corporate asset. The highly clinical, cold business term was somehow significantly more highly insulting than absolutely any highly toxic emotional betrayal. She absolutely hadn't entirely just been highly cruelly dumped. She had absolutely been highly strategically, violently, eliminated. "I profoundly understand," she stated, her beautiful voice violently hardening completely into solid steel. "Exactly one significantly more massive thing, William. The highly toxic divorce papers. Do absolutely not highly generously let the highly pathetic lawyer entirely of Julian highly legally file them. I will highly happily flawlessly handle the highly complex proceedings," William stated completely with a highly terrifying touch, entirely of solid steel, entirely in his deep voice. "We will highly aggressively file completely for highly toxic adultery and highly malicious fraud. His highly pathetic petition will be completely, violently buried. He absolutely will not completely know exactly what violently hit him. Exactly 1 short hour significantly later, a highly sleek, highly massive black Rolls-Royce Phantom, a highly expensive luxury car, so incredibly, completely out entirely of highly pathetic place, entirely in the highly modest suburb, that it could highly easily, highly possibly have absolutely been an alien spaceship. Highly silently, smoothly stopped perfectly on her highly quiet curb. A highly massive man, entirely in a highly impeccable, bespoke suit. Her brand new, highly terrifying head of elite security. Smoothly opened the heavy door completely for her. As Charlotte smoothly slid completely into the highly luxurious, expensive leather interior, she highly casually threw exactly one absolute last, highly indifferent glance directly at the highly modest house. The highly quiet, boring street. The highly pathetic life that was exactly now absolutely nothing, significantly more than a highly toxic, terrible bad dream. She absolutely did not actively look completely back. Exactly as the highly armored luxury car rapidly accelerated directly toward the highly exclusive private airfield. Exactly where a highly massive, sterling global private jet eagerly waited. The highly secure phone entirely of Charlotte. A highly advanced, brand new high-end satellite model flawlessly provided completely by her elite security. Brilliantly sprang completely to absolute life. It was a highly encrypted, highly secure message completely from William. Highly securely attached was exactly one single, highly massive document. The highly comprehensive, massive summary entirely of the highly lucrative holdings. Entirely of Sterling Global. Highly endless line, completely. After highly endless line, entirely of highly incomprehensible massive numbers, highly elite corporate names, and highly astronomical market values, violently stretching completely into the highly massive billions. At the absolute bottom was officially the highly absolute, total net worth entirely of the massive estate, which she exactly now completely, utterly controlled. $2.8 billion. She intensely looked directly at the highly massive number. Absolutely not, completely with pure joy or absolute triumph, but completely with a highly chilling, terrifying sense entirely of absolute purpose. Julian had highly arrogantly left her entirely for a highly arrogant woman, completely with massive resources. He had highly toxically belittled her entirely for actively having absolutely nothing. He had highly maliciously built his highly massive future completely on the highly fragile foundation entirely of her highly supposed, pathetic poverty. He highly arrogantly wanted to highly actively play entirely in the highly elite major leagues. She was actively about to flawlessly, brutally show him that he absolutely wasn't absolutely even actively playing entirely in the exact same massive sport. The highly pathetic, penniless orphan was completely, permanently dead. Charlotte Sterling. the highly terrifying multi-billionaire industrial titan, had highly miraculously returned completely from the highly toxic ashes. And she was highly aggressively coming to violently collect a highly massive debt entirely of 7 agonizing years, entirely of massive pain and absolute humiliation, completely with highly lethal compound interest. Charlotte just reclaimed her $2.8 billion empire. What do you think her first move against Julian and Genevieve should be? Tell us below. The Ice Queen reappears. The highly massive transformation entirely of Charlotte Sullivan, the highly pathetic suburban wife, completely into Charlotte Sterling, the highly formidable, terrifying CEO, was incredibly rapid and completely, utterly, absolute. It aggressively began the absolute, precise moment she confidently stepped completely onto the highly secure tarmac, entirely in massive Boston, and confidently entered the highly rarefied, elite air entirely of her highly exclusive former life. The highly massive luxury penthouse entirely at the highly exclusive Four Seasons. Completely with highly breathtaking panoramic views entirely of the highly majestic expanse entirely of the massive Boston Common. Was officially her highly secure chrysalis. It was a highly elite world entirely of highly silent, incredibly efficient, elite staff. Highly massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and the highly intoxicating ambient hum entirely of highly immense, absolute power. William Roth was highly anxiously waiting completely for her, confidently standing perfectly next, completely to a highly grand, massive mahogany table, heavily covered entirely with highly thick files and highly advanced electronic tablets. He visually looked significantly older than she intimately remembered, but his piercing eyes flawlessly conserved the exact same highly acute intelligence and completely unshakable, fierce loyalty. He absolutely did not highly emotionally hug her or highly pathetically offer highly useless platitudes. He simply highly politely gave her a highly small, incredibly respectful nod. "Highly welcome completely back, Miss Sterling," he stated. The highly elite title. So incredibly strange, entirely for so incredibly long. Flawlessly settled completely over her, exactly like a highly, perfectly, impeccably tailored suit. It is incredibly good to absolutely be completely back, William. The absolute first highly agonizing days were an absolute highly intense blur, entirely, of highly intense, massive briefings. She was an incredibly highly rapid study. Her highly brilliant mind, highly pathetically occupied entirely for so incredibly long, completely by highly pathetic domestic trivialities, highly flawlessly proving to absolutely be exactly as incredibly sharp and highly analytical exactly as her highly powerful fathers. She highly voraciously absorbed exactly 7 agonizing years entirely of highly complex market fluctuations, highly massive technological advancements, and highly ruthless corporate strategy completely with a highly ravenous, absolute appetite. She absolutely wasn't entirely just highly actively catching completely up. She was highly aggressively preparing entirely for massive war. The highly absolute physical transformation flawlessly unfolded entirely in highly strict parallel. The highly simple, pathetic, modest woman, completely from the highly pathetic suburbs, was highly systematically, completely erased. A highly elite team entirely of the absolute best, highly expensive stylists, elite personal trainers, and highly elite nutritionists entirely in massive Boston, aggressively descended completely upon the luxury penthouse. Her highly long, unkempt hair was highly ruthlessly cut, completely into a highly sleek, incredibly sharp bob that flawlessly framed her beautiful face and highly aggressively emphasized her striking cheekbones. Her highly pathetic wardrobe entirely of highly faded, cheap jeans and highly cheap cotton sweaters was completely, violently replaced completely by a highly carefully, meticulously curated collection entirely of highly imposing Tom Ford power suits, highly elegant, expensive Dior dresses, and highly dangerously, incredibly tall Christian Louboutin stilettos. Her brand new, highly expensive uniform was highly impenetrable armor. Every single highly expensive piece was highly carefully chosen, entirely to flawlessly project a highly terrifying aura, entirely of untouchable absolute power and highly freezing, icy elegance. She flawlessly learned exactly how to confidently walk completely with a highly brand new, terrifying posture. A highly straight-backed, absolute confidence that violently demanded absolute attention. The highly soft, highly gentle cadence entirely of her highly pathetic speech was flawlessly honed completely into a highly precise, highly measured tone that absolutely did not highly generously admit absolutely any pathetic argument. In exactly 1 short week, she was completely, utterly ready. Her highly anticipated reappearance absolutely would not be a highly discreet, quiet affair. It would absolutely be a highly explosive declaration. William had highly urgently organized a highly unexpected emergency meeting entirely of the massive board of directors entirely of Sterling Global. A highly powerful collection entirely of highly powerful, aging men who had highly comfortably grown incredibly comfortable entirely in her highly extended absence. Highly comfortably managing the massive empire completely under the highly firm hand entirely of William. But completely without a highly true, genuine Sterling, completely at the absolute helm. She confidently entered the highly massive boardroom entirely of Sterling Global, entirely on the highly imposing 80th floor entirely of their highly towering skyscraper, perfectly in massive Boston. The highly sharp click entirely of her highly expensive stilettos, completely on the highly polished marble floor, was the absolute only sound entirely in the highly cavernous room. Absolutely all highly sophisticated conversations completely, violently ceased. The exactly 12 highly powerful members entirely of the massive board. Highly terrifying titans entirely of elite industry completely, in their absolute own highly respected right. Intensely stared directly at her, exactly as if they had literally just vividly seen a highly terrifying ghost. They highly vividly remembered a highly quiet, highly grieving teenager. They were completely, utterly unprepared entirely for the highly terrifying woman who confidently stood perfectly before them exactly now. "Good highly morning, gentlemen," she stated. Her beautiful voice incredibly cold and highly firm, exactly as she confidently took her highly rightful place, completely at the absolute head entirely of the massive table. The highly massive seat entirely of her powerful father. "I highly formally apologize entirely for my highly extended absence. I was highly actively occupied entirely with completely other highly pressing matters. Highly confidently, rest completely assured, my highly extended sabbatical is completely, permanently over." She absolutely did not highly patiently wait entirely for their highly shocked responses. She highly aggressively launched completely straight directly into a highly brilliant, completely ruthless analysis, entirely of the highly complex performance, entirely of the massive company. highly sharply pointing completely out, highly massive missed opportunities, highly bloated, useless divisions, and a highly catastrophic lack entirely of highly aggressive innovation. She flawlessly laid completely out a highly bold, brand new massive vision entirely for Sterling Global. Exactly one that heavily involved a highly massive, aggressive push completely into highly sustainable advanced energy, and a highly strategic, massive acquisition entirely of a highly cutting-edge, elite AI firm. She absolutely possessed their highly absolute, completely undivided attention. The highly sleepy, highly complacent toxic energy entirely in the massive room had absolutely been completely replaced, completely by a highly palpable, highly explosive tension. A highly complex mixture entirely of blinding fear and highly reluctant, massive admiration. But her highly grand, massive strategy highly officially possessed a significantly more highly personal, incredibly specific target. Finally, she stated, her piercing eyes highly aggressively sweeping the massive room. I have highly meticulously reviewed the highly detailed file entirely on the highly recent pathetic ventures entirely of the massive Thorn Bank. Their highly pathetic attempts entirely to highly maliciously undermine our massive shipping logistics are highly amateurish, but highly, incredibly persistent. It is highly officially time that we highly aggressively send a highly lethal message. She highly smoothly displayed a highly brand new, complex file completely on the highly massive screen, perfectly at the absolute front entirely of the room. It was officially a highly innovative, mid-sized elite logistics firm, explicitly named Logi. Next, Logi Next has highly successfully developed a highly advanced, predictive shipping algorithm that could completely, violently revolutionize the absolute entire industry, she highly explicitly explained. The highly arrogant Thorns have absolutely been highly desperately attempting to successfully acquire them entirely for the absolute last 6 agonizing months. Their highly pathetic offer is currently highly toxically stalled entirely at exactly $900 million. She violently paused, highly generously letting the highly massive information flawlessly sink completely in. This highly specific morning, she aggressively continued, a highly terrifying shadow entirely of a lethal smile, highly gently touching her beautiful lips. Sterling Global highly officially presented a highly aggressive competing offer entirely for exactly $1.5 billion, completely entirely in highly liquid cash. The highly massive deal will flawlessly close exactly on highly anticipated Friday. A highly massive wave entirely of pure shock and highly explosive excitement violently rippled completely through the massive room. It was a highly aggressive, almost highly reckless massive move. It was an absolute, highly public direct attack completely across the highly arrogant bow entirely of Harrison Thorn. Furthermore, Charlotte stated, her piercing gaze completely turning to freezing ice, I have highly meticulously investigated the highly brand new private equity firm entirely of the arrogant Thorns. It is absolutely just a highly pathetic vanity project entirely for his highly spoiled daughter and her highly pathetic brand new associate. She highly deliberately let the highly heavy word flawlessly hang completely in the heavy air. It highly apparently seems that they are highly actively focusing their highly initial, pathetic investments entirely in the highly exclusive luxury hospitality sector. She highly sharply clicked directly to absolutely another highly complex slide. Exactly this one, highly meticulously detailing a highly massive portfolio entirely of elite boutique hotels. We will highly aggressively begin a highly systematic, massive acquisition entirely of highly key properties, entirely in absolutely every single highly specific market they highly desperately target. We will highly aggressively outbid them, violently absorb their highly coveted targets, and completely, violently drain their highly pathetic seed capital completely before they absolutely even successfully sign their absolute first highly pathetic deal. I fiercely want their highly pathetic firm to absolutely be a completely, utterly total failure. Is exactly that completely, explicitly clear? The highly powerful members entirely of the massive board, exactly once highly skeptical, exactly now intensely looked directly at her completely, with a highly brand new, absolute respect that highly terrifyingly bordered completely on absolute fear. This absolutely was not the highly innocent daughter entirely of Edward Sterling. This was officially a highly lethal predator. When the highly intense session finally adjourned, William highly quietly stayed completely behind. "A highly audacious, massive re-entry, Charlotte," he stated. A highly bright gleam entirely of absolute pride, beautifully shining entirely in his piercing eye. "You have highly flawlessly reminded them exactly who is officially completely in absolute charge." "I absolutely was not actively talking completely to them, William," she stated, intensely looking completely out the massive window directly at the massive city completely below. A highly terrifying asphalt jungle, exactly where absolutely only the highly strong miraculously survived. I was actively talking completely to him. She profoundly knew that the highly explosive news entirely of the highly massive acquisition entirely of Vlogi next would violently hit the highly elite financial world exactly like highly lethal thunder. Harrison Thorne would absolutely be completely, violently furious. And Julian, so incredibly, highly toxically proud entirely of his highly brand new, pathetic position. His highly brand new, pathetic life would absolutely be exactly perfectly in the absolute center entirely of the highly lethal blast radius. He highly arrogantly wanted to highly actively play entirely in the highly elite major leagues. She had literally just completely, violently changed the highly absolute rules entirely of his highly pathetic game. And he absolutely didn't even completely know that he was highly pathetically actively playing completely against her. "Charlotte is sabotaging Julian's company. Do you think she should go after him directly or keep ruining his deals? Tell us below." The horrific reckoning. Exactly 2 agonizing months violently passed. Julian Vance was highly happily living the highly fake life he had absolutely always beautifully dreamed entirely of. He and Genevieve Thorne were officially the highly coveted, brand new elite power couple entirely of the massive city. They had literally just highly proudly moved completely into a highly sprawling, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse entirely in the highly exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. A highly extravagant wedding gift completely from her highly powerful father. Julian officially possessed a highly elite brand new title. Senior Vice President entirely of Thorne Private Equity. A highly massive corner office completely with a highly breathtaking panoramic view entirely of the massive city, and a highly expensive wardrobe entirely of bespoke, tailored suits. He was finally, entirely in his absolute own, highly arrogant mind, a highly massive success. However, a highly terrifying, massive shadow aggressively loomed completely over his highly brand new, pathetic paradise. His absolute first, highly massive venture, a highly ambitious fund entirely to successfully acquire highly exclusive luxury boutique hotels, had absolutely been a highly spectacular, catastrophic failure. Every single highly coveted target they highly meticulously identified. Every single highly lucrative deal they highly aggressively pursued was highly inexplicably, violently snatched completely away, entirely, in the absolute last, agonizing minute, completely by a highly invisible, highly well-resourced, massive competitor. The highly toxic rumors entirely on the massive exchange, highly actively whispered, entirely about a highly, recently, incredibly aggressive, sterling global. But the highly massive moves were so incredibly precise, so incredibly highly targeted, that they physically felt incredibly, highly personal. Harrison Thorne was highly rapidly, actively losing massive capital and highly pristine prestige. And the highly massive pressure violently filtered completely directly to Julian. "It is an absolute, highly pathetic ghost," Harrison had violently growled completely at him, entirely in a highly stressful board meeting. "Absolutely someone is highly maliciously actively playing completely with us. And you completely with your highly fancy pathetic Ivy League degree absolutely cannot highly apparently actively figure completely out exactly who." Tonight, however, was highly officially supposed to absolutely be a highly beautiful respite. A highly massive celebration entirely of his highly elite status. It was the highly exclusive annual Starlight Gala, entirely at the highly prestigious Museum of Fine Arts. The highly absolute massive pinnacle, entirely of the highly elite Boston social calendar for Julian. Exactly this was his highly absolute, true arrival. He confidently stood perfectly, neck completely to Genevieve, her delicate neck heavily covered entirely in highly expensive Thorne diamonds, highly enthusiastically enjoying the highly blinding flash entirely of the paparazzi cameras and the highly adoring, toxic greetings entirely of the absolute highest elite, entirely of the massive city. He profoundly felt a highly massive surge, entirely of pure vindication. Exactly this was his highly absolute place. He deeply thought entirely for a highly fleeting, pathetic moment entirely about Charlotte. He highly toxically imagined her entirely in his highly small, pathetic house, entirely in the suburbs. Highly likely, actively watching absolutely some highly cheap television show. Completely, utterly oblivious, completely, to the highly brilliant, elite world he exactly now proudly inhabited. The highly toxic thought violently filled him completely with highly smug, toxic satisfaction. He had absolutely made the highly correct, absolute decision. The highly massive doors entirely of the grand main hall violently flew completely open. A highly deafening silence completely fell, completely over the massive crowd. A highly sudden, completely collective holding entirely of highly anxious breath. The highly massive sea entirely of highly famous faces flawlessly parted entirely for a highly brand new, terrifying figure to confidently pass completely through. She flawlessly wore a highly stunning, brilliant midnight blue silk designer dress that fiercely clung completely to her, exactly like a highly perfect second skin. Exactly one single, highly dazzling diamond necklace, beautifully resting perfectly on her delicate collarbone. The highly legendary, massive sterling star beautifully rested perfectly at her elegant throat, flawlessly catching the bright light and beautifully scattering it completely into exactly 1,000 highly brilliant tiny rainbows. Her highly dark hair was flawlessly styled entirely in an incredibly impeccable, sharp bob. And her piercing eyes, incredibly freezing cold and highly calculating, aggressively swept the massive room completely without actively missing a single tiny detail. She was heavily flanked completely by exactly two highly imposing men, the highly venerable William Roth and Mr. Kenji Tanaka, the highly brilliant and incredibly reclusive elite CEO entirely of a highly rival tech empire, a highly terrifying man who highly rarely ever actively made highly public appearances. Her highly absolute presence aggressively radiated an almost highly gravitational, massive pull entirely of absolute power and massive influence. The highly expensive champagne glass entirely of Julian violently slipped completely from his weak fingers, violently shattering completely on the highly polished marble floor. His hot blood completely, violently turned completely to freezing ice. The beautiful face was highly, incredibly familiar, but the highly terrifying woman was an absolute, complete impossibility. It was officially Charlotte, but it absolutely was not. It was exactly as if his highly quiet, highly simple, pathetic wife had absolutely been completely possessed entirely by the highly terrifying spirit entirely of a highly vengeful, absolute goddess. "Who exactly is exactly that?" Genevieve violently hissed perfectly by his broad side, her toxic voice incredibly tense, completely with highly toxic jealousy and massive intrigue. "I have absolutely never, ever vividly seen her completely before." A highly corpulent, red-faced elite banker who had absolutely been highly toxically fawning completely over them. Exactly short moments completely prior, laughed highly nervously. "You have absolutely been completely out entirely of the massive country way too incredibly long, Genevieve. That absolutely isn't absolutely just anyone. Exactly that is officially Charlotte Sterling." The highly massive name violently hit Julian exactly like a highly brutal, physical blow. Sterling. Sterling. Global. The highly terrifying ghost entirely in the massive machine that had absolutely been highly systematically, violently dismantling his highly pathetic professional life. It absolutely could not highly possibly be. It was a highly toxic joke. A highly terrifying nightmare. "Sterling?" Genevieve loudly repeated, her highly perfectly sculpted eyebrows violently shooting completely up. "The highly famous Charlotte Sterling? I genuinely thought she was a highly pathetic recluse, an absolute ghost." "Well," the elite banker stated, his piercing eyes violently fixed completely on the highly terrifying trio, confidently approaching. "The highly terrifying ghost has absolutely returned, and highly apparently, she is incredibly close friends completely with Kenji Tanaka. The highly massive rumor explicitly says they are highly actively, brutally working entirely on a highly massive merger. Can you highly possibly imagine? Sterling Global and Tanaka Industries could highly easily actively buy absolute God." Julian physically felt absolutely all the hot blood completely disappear entirely from his handsome face. His highly carefully, meticulously constructed toxic world was violently wobbling completely on its highly fragile axis. Absolutely all the highly complex pieces completely, violently clicked flawlessly into highly perfect place, completely with a highly horrific, absolute clarity. The highly catastrophic failed hotel deals, the highly aggressive acquisition entirely of Logi Next, the highly inexplicable and incredibly personal, highly toxic nature entirely of the massive attacks completely on the Thorns. Absolutely all entirely of it had absolutely been her. Exactly, as if she highly magnetically physically felt his highly terrified gaze. The piercing eyes entirely of Charlotte violently met completely with absolutely his, completely across the highly crowded, massive room. There was absolutely zero highly tiny flash, entirely of pure recognition, nor absolutely any highly pathetic hint, entirely of their highly toxic shared past. Her highly piercing gaze was entirely of completely complete, absolute indifference. The exact, highly specific kind that absolutely one might highly casually give directly to a highly pathetic piece, entirely of cheap furniture, or a highly particularly uninteresting, pathetic insect. Exactly. That highly freezing look was significantly more completely devastating than absolutely any highly violent scream or highly toxic accusation could highly possibly absolutely have been. It highly explicitly told him that he was officially absolutely nothing completely to her. Kenji. And William smoothly moved completely through the massive room. A highly powerful, massive whirlwind. The highly elite people that Julian had absolutely been highly desperately attempting to successfully impress were exactly now highly pathetically bending completely over absolutely backward, simply entirely to successfully obtain exactly one highly brief moment entirely of her highly precious time. Harrison Thorne, the highly formidable, arrogant father entirely of Genevieve, confidently approached Charlotte completely with a highly tense, incredibly obsequious fake smile. "Miss Sterling," Harrison stated, his toxic voice heavily dripping completely with highly fake cordiality. "An absolute massive pleasure entirely to finally successfully meet you. I am officially Harrison Thorne." Charlotte highly coldly extended a highly freezing, elegantly gloved soft hand. "Mr. Thorne, I have absolutely been highly closely actively following your highly recent, pathetic difficulties entirely in the massive market. Incredibly, highly unfortunate." Her beautiful voice was absolute, pure silk. But the heavy words were absolute, pure, lethal poison. Harrison's handsome face violently tensed. "Indeed, it highly apparently seems that we officially possess a highly brand new, incredibly aggressive massive player, completely with whom we desperately need to actively deal. Absolute aggression is simply absolutely just completely another heavy word, entirely for massive efficiency." Charlotte highly smoothly countered, completely before, highly elegantly, completely turning her absolute entire, highly intense attention directly to Kenji Tanaka, highly ruthlessly discarding the highly arrogant Thorne patriarch exactly as if he were absolutely just a highly pathetic junior associate. Genevieve intensely observed, her beautiful face a highly toxic mask, entirely of pure fury and absolute humiliation. She violently turned completely toward Julian, her toxic voice a highly venomous, lethal whisper. "Do you intimately know her?" "No." "Then exactly how do you intimately know Charlotte Sterling?" Julian literally could not actively speak. His dry throat was completely, utterly dry. His brilliant mind was an absolute chaotic symphony, entirely of massive denial and pure, unadulterated terror. Genevieve's piercing eyes violently narrowed. A highly astute, incredibly calculating toxic light brilliantly entering completely into them. She intensely looked completely from the highly ashen, highly terrified face, entirely of Julian, directly to the highly magnificent, terrifying figure, entirely of Charlotte Sterling. And then completely back, completely again, a highly slow, completely terrifying, massive horror, beautifully spread completely across her highly elegant features. "Oh my absolute God!" She heavily breathed, the highly catastrophic comprehension violently hitting her. She is officially your highly pathetic ex-wife, the highly poor, highly pathetic, simple orphan that you highly toxically, explicitly told me entirely about. It was officially her. Julian could absolutely only highly pathetically nod. Exactly one single, highly jerky, pathetic movement. The highly smug, toxic satisfaction that he had profoundly felt exactly short minutes completely prior had completely, violently turned completely into highly abject, absolute terror. He had absolutely, not entirely, just highly arrogantly divorced a highly simple woman completely from the highly pathetic suburbs. He had violently betrayed, highly publicly humiliated, and highly ruthlessly discarded the absolute most highly powerful woman entirely in the massive room. He highly arrogantly thought he was actively successfully climbing a highly elite ladder. Instead, he had literally just completely, blindly, jumped completely off a highly terrifying, massive cliff. And he was absolutely only highly actively beginning to horrifyingly realize exactly how incredibly far he highly actively had to violently fall. Julian finally knows the truth. Do you think Charlotte went too far, or did Julian deserve everything he got? Tell us below. The final lesson. In the highly agonizing weeks completely following the highly explosive gala, the highly pathetic life entirely of Julian completely, violently crumbled completely with highly brutal, terrifying speed. The highly massive name Sterling was an absolute, highly lethal death sentence entirely for his highly pathetic career, entirely at the Thorn Bank. Harrison, completely, publicly humiliated and violently furious, highly aggressively treated him completely with highly open, toxic contempt. Genevieve, vividly seeing him exactly now, absolutely not exactly as a highly valuable prize, but exactly as the absolute biggest, most pathetic fool entirely in the massive world, was incredibly cold and highly distant. Their highly toxic relationship completely, violently devolved completely into a highly endless series entirely of highly bitter, whispered violent arguments entirely in their highly cavernous, highly silent luxury penthouse. The highly exclusive social invitations completely, violently, dried completely up. The highly fawning elite colleagues exactly now highly actively, aggressively avoided his highly terrified gaze. He was a completely, highly toxic pariah, a highly pathetic walking cautionary tale. Charlotte, meanwhile, highly successfully operated completely from a highly elite sphere, so incredibly highly above him that he could absolutely only highly pathetically, vividly see the highly catastrophic consequences. She was a highly permanent fixture, entirely in the highly elite financial news, an absolute, massive industry supernova. The highly massive Sterling-Tanaka merger was actively being highly officially hailed exactly as the absolute massive deal entirely of the massive century, flawlessly creating a highly massive, global behemoth that completely, violently dwarfed absolutely all highly pathetic competitors. Every single highly massive move she actively made was incredibly precise, highly strategic, and completely, devastatingly effective, but completely in the absolute middle entirely of the highly ruthless corporate war and highly complex financial machinations. Charlotte profoundly felt completely empty. The highly massive revenge, although incredibly satisfying, was a highly hollow, pathetic victory. She had completely, violently dismantled the highly pathetic world entirely of Julian, But she had absolutely not successfully filled the highly massive void entirely in her absolute own. The luxury penthouse physically felt significantly less exactly like a highly warm home, and significantly more exactly like a highly gilded, terrifying cage. One highly rainy Tuesday afternoon, highly desperately seeking absolute refuge completely from her absolute own highly complex thoughts, she fiercely did absolutely something she absolutely hadn't actively done entirely in agonizing years. She confidently went completely incognito directly to a highly small, independent elite art gallery, entirely in the highly bohemian South End neighborhood, entirely of Boston. Flawlessly dressed entirely in highly simple jeans, a highly soft cashmere sweater, and a highly simple baseball cap aggressively pulled completely down. She absolutely was not absolutely anyone. She was absolutely just a highly simple woman, intensely looking entirely at beautiful art. The highly quiet gallery was incredibly peaceful. The heavy air aggressively smelled entirely of highly sharp linseed oil and highly strong turpentine. The beautiful art was incredibly raw, highly powerful, and completely full entirely of a highly desperate, highly beautiful energy. She was highly particularly intensely drawn, completely, to a highly massive series entirely of highly large abstract canvases, highly chaotic, massive swirls entirely of deep black, pure white, and a highly defiant, bright electric blue. They beautifully spoke directly of the highly violent storm, completely inside her absolute own fragile soul. They successfully possess absolutely something highly special, don't they? The highly low, incredibly resonant, deep voice violently startled her. She smoothly turned completely around entirely to vividly see a highly handsome man confidently standing perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to her. He was incredibly tall, completely with highly kind, intelligent eyes, and strong hands, highly heavily stained, completely with bright paint. He flawlessly wore a highly simple t-shirt, heavily splattered, completely with bright paint, and highly worn, cheap jeans. He intensely looked directly at the beautiful paintings, absolutely not entirely at her, completely with a highly profound look, entirely of absolute comprehension, perfectly on his handsome face. "They are incredibly honest," Charlotte replied, the heavy words completely surprising absolutely even completely herself. "That is officially him," the handsome man stated, gently nodding directly toward a highly focused figure entirely in the quiet corner. The highly passionate artist actively talking highly animatedly completely with a highly potential elite buyer. Leo O'Connell. He passionately paints exactly as if he were highly desperately actively attempting to violently break completely out entirely of a highly locked, secure room. Absolute passion and pure frust. The handsome man finally smoothly turned his piercing gaze directly to her. A highly warm, incredibly genuine, beautiful smile, beautifully crinkling the highly soft corners entirely of his piercing eyes. "I am officially the absolute owner. David Martin, Charlotte, highly completely taken, completely by massive surprise, smoothly introduced completely herself, absolutely simply, exactly as Elena. For the absolute next, highly peaceful hour, David happily accompanied her completely through the quiet gallery, highly intelligently talking entirely about the beautiful art. Absolutely not completely with the highly pretentious, toxic jargon entirely of the highly elite art world, but completely with a highly simple, incredibly sincere, pure passion. He vividly saw the highly beautiful story entirely in absolutely every single highly passionate brushstroke. The highly raw emotion perfectly behind absolutely every single highly specific color choice. He absolutely did not highly intrusively ask her exactly what she actively did, exactly where she highly expensively lived, or exactly who she intimately knew. He simply happily talked completely to her entirely about beautiful art. She profoundly felt a highly massive part entirely of her that she genuinely thought was completely dead, aggressively begin to beautifully stir. It was officially the highly passionate art history student, completely from the highly elite university. The highly young, beautiful woman who had absolutely been completely captivated entirely by absolute beauty and pure creation. Absolutely not completely by highly cold balance sheets and highly ruthless market capitalizations. She highly surprisingly found completely herself, happily returning directly to the quiet gallery, highly several massive times, completely during the highly beautiful following weeks. She and David beautifully developed a highly easy, comfortable rapport. Their highly engaging conversations smoothly shifted completely from beautiful art directly to heavy books, to beautiful music, to the highly simple, beautiful absurdities entirely of pure life, entirely in massive Boston. With him, she absolutely was not a highly terrifying Sterling. She was absolutely just Elena, a highly simple woman completely with a highly sharp eye and a highly quiet, beautiful sadness, into which he absolutely did not highly intrusively pry. He was a highly welcome, beautiful anchor, entirely in the highly turbulent, massive sea, entirely of her highly brand new, massive life. Meanwhile, a highly unexpected, brand new, massive player confidently entered the highly complex game. Kenji Tanaka, her highly brilliant, brand new elite business partner, absolutely was not the highly freezing, reclusive genius that the highly toxic media highly falsely portrayed. In their highly private, secure meetings, she beautifully discovered a highly brilliant man, completely with a highly dry, sharp wit, a highly fierce, terrifying intellect, and a highly, almost completely disconcerting, massive ability entirely to vividly see, completely straight, entirely through her highly carefully constructed, impenetrable armor. During a highly intense, late-night strategy session, entirely in the highly massive Sterling Global boardroom, exactly as they highly meticulously finalized the highly complex details entirely of the massive merger. He completely, highly suddenly, stopped. Intensely looking directly at her, completely over the highly delicate rim, entirely of his expensive teacup. "Have you highly genuinely enjoyed exactly this?" he softly asked, his piercing dark eyes incredibly intense. Violently dismantling the highly arrogant thorns, highly publicly humiliating your highly toxic ex-husband. Charlotte completely, violently stiffened. It was a highly necessary, highly critical business strategy. Kenji highly smoothly permitted a highly small, highly knowing toxic smile. Absolutely, of course, but highly toxic revenge is an absolute fire that completely, violently consumes the highly pathetic person who actively wields it. Miss Sterling, it will highly successfully actively keep you incredibly warm entirely for a highly short while, but highly eventually, you are completely, utterly left entirely alone, completely with absolutely nothing but highly pathetic ashes. He gently set his expensive cup completely down. Harrison Thorne is a highly pathetic old fool. Your highly arrogant husband is a highly insignificant, pathetic parasite. They are absolutely not highly worthy entirely of the highly massive energy you are actively, highly aggressively spending completely on them. Exactly this. He gently pointed directly at the highly massive merger plan. Our massive company. Exactly that is highly worthy entirely of your massive energy. The highly bright future that we can highly successfully build is highly worthy entirely of it. His highly heavy words violently touched a highly sensitive, exposed chord, completely deep entirely inside her. He absolutely wasn't highly toxically judging her. He was highly aggressively challenging her. He vividly saw her absolutely not exactly as a highly lethal weapon entirely of toxic revenge, but exactly as a highly brilliant, absolute leader. And he was highly aggressively calling her entirely to absolutely be significantly better. He was the absolute first, highly genuine person, entirely in her brand new massive life, entirely to actively talk entirely about the massive future. Absolutely not entirely about the highly toxic past. What exactly do you highly actively propose? She softly asked, her beautiful voice incredibly low. I highly actively propose that we completely stop highly pathetically actively playing entirely on the highly defensive, he stated, his piercing eyes brilliantly shining completely with a highly brand new, massive intensity. Let's highly aggressively build absolutely something completely revolutionary. Let's highly aggressively focus our highly massive resources entirely on the highly innovative, sustainable energy division. Let's miraculously create absolutely something that completely, violently changes the absolute entire massive world. Absolutely not entirely just highly pathetically settling highly old toxic scores. Exactly that is an absolute massive victory, highly worthy entirely of a Sterling and a Tanaka. It was an absolute, highly massive turning point. The highly brilliant challenge entirely of Kenji, flawlessly combined completely with the highly simple, beautiful human connection she was miraculously finding completely with David, entirely in the quiet art gallery, aggressively began to completely, beautifully shift her highly massive perspective. The absolute, white-hot rage that had highly toxically fueled her was aggressively beginning to beautifully cool, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly brand new and significantly more highly compelling, massive ambition. She had highly successfully demonstrated that she could completely, violently destroy. Exactly now, she aggressively began to highly actively wonder exactly if she could miraculously build completely anew. The highly explosive war completely against Julian and the arrogant Thorns was completely, flawlessly won. But the highly massive battle entirely for her absolute own fragile soul, entirely for the highly powerful woman she desperately wanted to miraculously become, was absolutely only highly actively beginning, and entirely for the absolute first time. She profoundly felt that she absolutely did not actively have to violently fight completely alone. She had miraculously found highly loyal allies. Absolutely not entirely in highly toxic bankers and elite lawyers, but entirely in the highly quiet gallery, entirely of a highly passionate artist, and completely across a highly massive boardroom table, entirely from a highly brilliant man who vividly saw her highly massive future. Absolutely not entirely just her highly toxic past. The unconditional surrender, The highly catastrophic freefall entirely of Julian Vance was incredibly rapid and completely brutal. Highly publicly fired, completely from the arrogant thorns, he completely, violently, became entirely toxic. Entirely in the highly elite financial scene. His highly luxurious, expensive lifestyle completely evaporated completely after a highly nasty, toxic annulment, completely from Genevieve, who absolutely even highly legally forced him to completely legally, actively change his highly arrogant last name entirely to violently cut absolutely all massive ties, completely with her powerful family, completely destroyed, violently stripped entirely of his absolute identity. He highly pathetically moved completely into a highly gloomy, cheap apartment perfectly on the highly absolute outskirts, exactly where his highly toxic ambition violently festered completely into a highly dangerous toxic obsession. In his highly twisted toxic logic, Charlotte officially owed him entirely for highly actively waking her completely up. And he highly toxically convinced himself that he could absolutely still highly miraculously win her completely back. He aggressively began a highly pathetic, massive campaign entirely of highly toxic harassment. Literally dozens entirely of highly pathetic emails and highly desperate voice messages, highly pathetically pleading, and then highly toxically threatening. Absolutely all highly efficiently intercepted. Completely by the highly elite team entirely of William. When his highly toxic messages aggressively remained completely unanswered, his massive desperation violently pushed him entirely to highly dangerously actively stalk her. One highly rainy afternoon, he highly illegally evaded elite security, highly aggressively confronting her entirely in the highly exclusive private elevator lobby exactly as she was confidently leaving completely with Kenji Tanaka. "Charlotte!" he violently screamed, his highly pathetic appearance completely disheveled, his piercing eyes completely wild. She intensely looked directly at the highly empty, pathetic shell entirely of the exact man completely with whom she had exactly once happily married. "Julian," she stated, her beautiful voice completely, utterly devoid entirely of absolutely any emotion. "You desperately need to completely stop exactly this." "Stop exactly this?" He laughed highly hysterically. "I am absolutely only highly actively beginning. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think you can completely violently ruin me and highly simply confidently walk completely away? I intimately know the highly true, absolute you, the highly terrified, pathetic woman highly pathetically actively playing cheap dress-up. Exactly this absolutely is not you." Kenji confidently stepped incredibly slightly, perfectly in front, entirely of her. "I highly genuinely think you absolutely should highly rapidly leave." The highly toxic gaze entirely of Julian, violently filled completely with pure hatred. "And exactly who the hell are you? Her highly pathetic brand new elite pet?" Charlotte violently interrupted him, her beautiful voice exactly like freezing ice. "He is officially my highly elite partner, Julian. Absolutely something that you absolutely never, ever truly were." She smoothly turned completely around and confidently left completely, without a single, highly brief second glance. The highly public, brutal rejection violently pushed him completely over the absolute edge. If he absolutely could not successfully have her, he would completely, violently destroy her. He highly maliciously sold a highly twisted, completely fabricated, highly toxic story directly to a highly notorious, sleazy tabloid journalist, Mr. Marcus Fletcher, highly pathetically painting completely himself exactly as the highly innocent victim entirely of a highly manipulative, mentally unstable, elite heiress. She highly maliciously hid her massive billions entirely to highly toxically trap an innocent, unsuspecting husband. The highly sensational headlines violently screamed. The highly toxic story, completely filled entirely with highly intimate, heavily distorted toxic details, highly maliciously designed, entirely to highly successfully give it highly fake credibility. Simultaneously, Harrison Thorne, highly desperately seeking highly toxic revenge, highly maliciously fed, highly damaging toxic stories directly to the highly elite financial press, highly toxically questioning the absolute stability and elite suitability entirely of Charlotte, entirely to successfully direct a highly massive global empire. The highly combined massive assault was an absolute, highly perfect toxic storm. The highly valuable shares entirely of Sterling Global highly aggressively suffered a highly minor, temporary hit, and highly toxic whispers entirely about the absolute sanity. Entirely of Charlotte aggressively began to actively circulate entirely in the highly nervous markets. She was actively in a highly critical meeting completely with William and Kenji exactly when the highly explosive news violently broke. William was completely, violently apoplectic, highly aggressively, actively planning a highly massive, multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit. Charlotte, however, was highly, eerily, completely calm exactly as she meticulously read the highly toxic article. Inside, the highly freezing, cold rage entirely of the highly terrifying night that Julian highly cruelly left her completely, violently solidified. He had highly maliciously converted their highly sacred intimacy completely into a highly lethal weapon, highly toxically twisting the beautiful life she had highly lovingly built, completely from pure love, completely into absolutely something highly pathological. Do absolutely not highly legally sue them, William, Charlotte stated incredibly quietly. We absolutely must, he violently insisted. We absolutely cannot highly generously let exactly this highly toxic garbage permanently stand. No, she stated firmly, her piercing eyes brilliantly shining completely with a highly brand new, highly dangerous lethal light. A highly massive lawsuit is absolutely just a highly pathetic battle. He has highly officially declared an absolute massive war. And entirely in a highly massive war, you absolutely do not highly pathetically file highly boring paperwork. You highly aggressively demand highly absolute, unconditional surrender. She smoothly turned directly toward Kenji, a highly chilling, terrifying smile perfectly on her beautiful face. He highly arrogantly thinks he can highly successfully control the highly toxic narrative completely by highly publicly exposing our highly toxic past. He has completely, catastrophically forgotten exactly one highly massive detail. I absolutely also intimately know absolutely all his highly dirty, toxic secrets, and completely unlike him, I officially possess the highly undeniable, absolute proof. The highly pathetic time entirely for highly reactively reacting was completely, permanently over. Julian and the arrogant Thorns had highly aggressively pushed her way too incredibly, catastrophically far, highly toxically mistaking her highly absolute restraint entirely for highly pathetic weakness. Exactly now, she would highly aggressively show them exactly what absolute, true massive power actually visually looked exactly like. She would completely, permanently end exactly this. Absolutely, not completely, by highly pathetically winning, but completely by highly utterly annihilating them completely entirely. The highly massive counterattack entirely of Charlotte, absolutely, was not exactly one single, highly explosive, massive event, but a highly masterfully orchestrated, highly lethal symphony entirely of absolute destruction. It aggressively began incredibly quietly. She highly aggressively unleashed the highly terrifying, massive power entirely of the highly elite legal and highly advanced intelligence divisions. Entirely of Sterling Global, the highly ruthless teams that William Roth had highly meticulously maintained incredibly sharp. Her absolute first highly massive target was Marcus Fletcher and his highly sleazy tabloid. In highly short days, the highly elite investigators entirely of Sterling Global had highly successfully unearthed a highly toxic career completely filled entirely with highly illegal corruption. William absolutely did not highly pathetically file a massive lawsuit. He highly personally, flawlessly delivered the highly complete, incredibly damning file directly to the highly powerful office entirely of the elite district attorney. Fletcher was highly publicly violently arrested, and the highly toxic story he had highly maliciously written entirely about Charlotte was publicly completely highly publicly discredited. Next, she highly aggressively directed her highly intense attention entirely to Harrison Thorne. While he had absolutely been highly busy, highly maliciously planting highly toxic stories entirely of her highly fake instability, the highly elite team entirely of Charlotte had absolutely been highly actively conducting a highly deep, highly invasive forensic audit entirely of the absolute entire massive Thorne bank operation. They highly successfully found a highly massive, undeniable pattern entirely of highly illegal insider trading and highly massive corporate fraud. The highly damning evidence was completely, undeniably irrefutable. William Roth highly urgently organized a highly private, secure meeting completely with the massive Thorne board, highly specifically excluding Harrison. He flawlessly exposed the highly damning evidence, highly calmly, explicitly explaining that Sterling Global exactly now legally held a highly massive controlling stake entirely in the highly toxic Thorne massive debt. The highly lethal message was completely, terrifyingly clear. Either Harrison Thorne was highly publicly, violently ousted, or Sterling Global would highly publicly publish the highly damning evidence and highly aggressively, highly legally call entirely in their massive debt. An absolute, highly catastrophic act that would completely, violently vaporize the highly massive Thorne legacy. In exactly 24 highly agonizing hours, the massive board highly officially announced that Harrison was highly permanently resigning, highly falsely citing highly fake health reasons. His highly toxic attack completely on Charlotte had catastrophically cost him his absolute entire massive empire. The highly massive final piece entirely of her highly lethal strategy was highly specifically reserved entirely for Julian. It would absolutely be the absolute most highly public and completely devastating fatal blow entirely of absolutely all. She highly confidently accepted her absolute first highly public televised interview completely with Mrs. Sarah Jimenez, a highly legendary elite journalist highly explicitly known entirely for her highly tough, highly intrusive questions. The highly anticipated interview highly publicly aired completely, live entirely, in highly exclusive prime time. Charlotte confidently stepped completely out, visually looking incredibly serene, and highly terrifyingly powerful, entirely in a highly simple, beautiful white designer dress. During the absolute first, highly calm half, she highly eloquently spoke entirely about her highly massive vision, entirely, for Sterling Global. Then, Jimenez highly aggressively shifted massive gears. "Miss Sterling, I absolutely must highly politely ask you entirely about the highly recent, incredibly highly public toxic attacks completely on your highly pristine character. Your highly toxic ex-husband, Julian Vance, has highly publicly made absolutely some incredibly highly serious, toxic accusations." Charlotte intensely looked completely into the bright camera. Her beautiful expression exactly one entirely of highly sad, absolute resolution. "He highly actively did," she stated incredibly calmly. "Julian and I were highly legally married entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. Entirely at his highly specific request. I highly peacefully lived a highly simple life, completely separated entirely from the highly massive resources entirely of my powerful family. I highly bravely did exactly this entirely because I was completely, deeply, entirely in pure love." The highly toxic, fake story he highly maliciously told was a highly painful, incredibly twisted fake version entirely of our beautiful life. But exactly what he highly toxically absolutely failed to explicitly mention was the highly absolute, true reason exactly why our beautiful marriage completely, violently ended. From a highly sleek, pristine folder, she smoothly pulled completely out a highly official, sworn affidavit, highly meticulously detailing the highly toxic affair entirely of Julian, completely with Genevieve Thorne, which highly aggressively began significantly, more than an entire agonizing year, completely before their highly brutal divorce. Then, she highly proudly displayed highly damning, secure emails, completely between Julian and Harrison Thorne, highly meticulously describing the highly toxic plan entirely to highly maliciously trade, entirely in his highly pathetic, penniless wife, entirely for a highly lucrative senior role, entirely in the massive firm. "He absolutely didn't entirely just highly cruelly leave me," Charlotte proudly declared. "He highly maliciously sold me." The highly secure control room was entirely in a highly stunned, dead silence. But she absolutely was not completely finished. "Mr. Vance has highly maliciously accused me entirely of completely, violently ruining him. The absolute brutal truth is that he was absolutely never, ever the true man he highly pathetically pretended entirely to absolutely be." She highly aggressively slid his highly old, highly toxic credit card statements completely across the massive table. These highly official documents highly meticulously detail exactly thousands entirely of massive euros, highly illegally spent, entirely on highly expensive luxury items. Entirely, while he highly toxically, explicitly told me that we absolutely could not highly possibly afford entirely to successfully fix a highly dangerous leak entirely in our highly modest roof. And exactly this. She highly confidently held completely up exactly one absolute last, highly damning sheet. Is officially his highly elite university application. Exactly where he highly maliciously lied entirely about actively being a highly pathetic orphan, significantly long completely before he absolutely ever miraculously met me. The absolute entire highly toxic life entirely of Julian Vance has absolutely been a highly calculated, massive fraud. She intensely looked completely back directly at the bright camera. her piercing eyes incredibly clear. I absolutely did not completely, violently destroy exactly that highly toxic man. I simply highly gracefully held completely up a highly clear mirror. My absolute only highly pathetic fault was fiercely loving absolutely someone completely, utterly incapable, entirely of fiercely loving absolutely anyone, completely else, entirely, other than his absolute own self. I have highly agonizingly paid the highly massive price, entirely, for exactly that highly catastrophic mistake. And exactly no. Highly absolutely. So incredibly has he. She smoothly ended the highly explosive interview completely by highly officially announcing the highly massive launch entirely of the Sterling Foundation. A highly massive €2 billion trust, highly specifically, entirely to highly generously support the highly vulnerable victims, entirely of highly toxic emotional and highly financial abuse. In his highly gloomy, cheap apartment, Julian intensely watched completely, violently sobbing. She had completely, utterly, highly, publicly exposed him absolutely entirely. The highly massive reckoning was completely, absolutely final. The horizon, in the highly massive aftermath, the entire massive world vividly saw Charlotte exactly as a highly terrifying model entirely of absolute strength. The highly valuable shares entirely of Sterling Global violently skyrocketed. Julian, a highly toxic, complete social leper, completely, permanently disappeared. Highly toxically rumored entirely to be brutally working entirely in a highly low-level, pathetic job, entirely and absolutely some highly obscure, pathetic province. A highly pathetic ghost, entirely of his absolute own. Highly toxic ambitions, the beautiful life entirely of Charlotte, entirely for the absolute first time, was highly genuinely, truly hers. The absolute white-hot rage had completely, beautifully subsided, flawlessly leaving absolute, pure peace. The massive empire was absolutely no longer a highly heavy burden, but a highly powerful tool entirely to highly miraculously innovate and aggressively build. Under her highly brilliant leadership, and exactly that entirely, of Kenji Tanaka, the highly newly merged Sterling Tanaka Global miraculously became an absolute, highly undisputed global leader entirely in highly advanced, sustainable technology. Her highly massive work was her highly pure passion, a highly massive legacy that would completely, violently dwarf the highly petty, toxic dramas entirely of her highly toxic past. Her highly elite partnership completely with Kenji was exactly one entirely of highly profound, absolute mutual respect and highly beautifully shared massive vision. But it was completely outside the highly sterile boardroom, exactly where she miraculously found the highly quiet, pure joy that had entirely for so incredibly long highly eluded her. She highly happily continued her highly peaceful visits directly to the highly beautiful art gallery, entirely of David Martin. Absolutely always, highly, simply exactly as Elena. He successfully remained a highly fundamental, beautifully grounding force, deeply drawn completely to her highly quiet intelligence and highly resilient, beautiful spirit, profoundly knowing absolutely nothing entirely of her highly immense, terrifying power. One highly crisp, beautiful autumn afternoon. Exactly one entire beautiful year, completely after her highly explosive return. They were peacefully walking completely through the highly majestic Retiro Park. "You visually look significantly lighter," David highly astutely observed. Charlotte beautifully smiled. "I profoundly feel significantly lighter. There is absolutely something highly massive that I desperately need to explicitly tell you. My exact name absolutely is not Elena." She explicitly told him absolutely everything. The highly massive name Sterling, the highly hidden, pathetic life, the highly toxic betrayal, the highly explosive return. David intensely listened incredibly patiently. When she finally completely finished, a highly long, profound silence beautifully stretched completely between them. "So," he finally stated, a highly slow, incredibly warm, beautiful smile beautifully spreading completely across his handsome face. "Does exactly this explicitly mean that I absolutely have to highly aggressively begin actively calling you Miss Sterling?" Charlotte laughed loudly, a highly beautiful sound entirely of pure, unadulterated relief. "I highly fiercely prefer Charlotte." "Well, Charlotte," he stated, his piercing eyes brilliantly shining, "it is an absolute massive pleasure to finally successfully meet you. Exactly now, are you actively going to successfully finish exactly that hot coffee? Or are you actively going to highly arrogantly use your massive billions entirely to highly expensively buy the absolute entire massive cart in exactly that highly magical moment, confidently standing perfectly in the highly beating absolute heart entirely of the massive city that she exactly now completely commanded? She profoundly felt a highly deep, absolute sensation entirely of pure fulfillment. She had bravely faced the absolute ultimate, highly toxic betrayal, and had miraculously emerged absolutely not entirely just highly victorious, but completely, utterly whole. She was beautifully surrounded completely by highly genuine people who vividly saw her entirely for exactly who she truly, genuinely was. Kenji, who highly profoundly respected her highly brilliant mind. David, who deeply appreciated her beautiful spirit. She had completely, violently lost a highly pathetic fantasy, highly maliciously built, completely on a highly toxic lie. But she had miraculously, beautifully gained absolutely something significantly, infinitely more highly valuable. A highly beautiful, absolute reality, completely entirely of her absolute own. The highly pathetic hidden heiress was completely, permanently, completely forever, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly powerful woman who confidently stood highly proudly, entirely, in the highly bright light. The absolute, undisputed owner, entirely of her absolute own, highly vast, brilliantly shining, and completely, utterly, limitless, beautiful horizon. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking journey of ultimate empowerment and epic revenge. Do you fiercely think Charlotte destroying Julian on live TV was the best karma ever? Which moment of her transformation was your absolute favorite? Drop your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button, share this empowering story of strength, and subscribe to our channel for more explosive, life-changing stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.